So I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Adam Brock. He is from the Denver based nonprofit called the GrowHaus, which he is also an urban permaculturist, food justice advocate, designer, entrepreneur, teacher, and he explores the intersection of food systems, social justice, and alternative economics. He's the co-founder of the GrowHaus, which is an urban farming and education greenhouse in Denver. He's also a member of the Sustainable Food Policy Council, and he's going to help us rethink our relationship with the land, social justice, and all these issues through the framework of ecological culture. So, can we please have a warm welcome for Mr. Adam Brock?
Can everybody hear me without the mic? All right, great. Well, first, I want to kind of bounce that shout out back to Boulder Food Rescue for putting this event on. I think it's really, really timely. It's great to see so many people coming together around this issue of getting food to people who really desperately need it the most, and not just all of us that can afford to go to the farmer's market. And it's been really inspiring to see, for me, to see how many different perspectives there are on this stuff, and how many different solutions there are out there when we just start putting our heads together and getting creative. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is actually looking at this issue from a really different perspective. You know, a lot of the food security dialogue is around kind of the short-term issue of addressing hunger, which is extremely important, and my heart and gratitude goes out to all of the organizations here today that are doing that good work. What I'd like to do, though, for a little bit is zoom out and look at what does food security mean in the big picture here in Colorado? What does it mean in the long term, over the next 20 years, 30 years, hundreds of years? What might it look like for us to really, truly be food secure as an ecosystem, as a community living in an ecosystem in this place that's really unique in terms of food production, and that honestly has never had permanent human settlement in a sustainable way. So I'm going to give some kind of ideas and strategies for that again are kind of a very broad thing, but first I do want to start by sharing more of the short-term issues that I work with on a daily basis over at the GrowHaus. So first, could I get a show of hands? How many folks have been to the GrowHaus or are familiar with our kind of general model for addressing food justice? Cool, so about half. So that's great. So I'm going to briefly talk about what the GrowHaus is doing in one specific community around food security, and then kind of zoom out and look at our bioregion as a whole. So this is a map of Denver. It's not like the usual maps you're used to seeing. It's a dot density map. So each dot represents 5 or 10 people, and the color of the dot represents the racial background of that person. So blue is white people, orange is Latino, and green is African American. And so I find this really helpful to understand how segregated Denver really is. And it just makes it really clear how there's huge areas, like this is Commerce City up here, that are just totally cut off from the rest of town, and don't necessarily have access to the services that most of us take for granted. So you really can't address food security without addressing these issues of structural racism and classism, right? And it's just very clear on this map how those have been playing out. So the GrowHaus is located in one of these areas. It's this kind of little triangle-shaped area here called Elyria Swansea. And it's one of the oldest neighborhoods in Denver. And it has these great, cute little single-family homes. But it's basically this island of homes surrounded by miles and miles of factories and interstate highways and main rail lines. And according to the EPA, it's one of the most polluted zip codes in the entire state of Colorado. So these are just some shots of people in the neighborhood. She's holding her nose because she's right in front of the dog food factory, which stinks up the whole neighborhood. The alleyways are unpaved, and then this is kind of it when it comes to your food needs. It's Snickers and 2-liter bottles of Coke. So in the middle of this neighborhood was an old processing facility for Lara's flowers. It was this big old 20,000 square foot greenhouse that had been sitting vacant for years. Unfortunately, a local developer named Paul Tamburello in 2009 saw the opportunity in that structure and purchased it with the intention of creating a hub for thinking differently about how we relate to food. And so over the last 5 years, myself and many other people have been working together to create that hub, which is called the GrowHaus. And so this is what it looks like now on the outside. And so there's a lot of stuff going on with the GrowHaus, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on our efforts at food distribution and food security. So we definitely feel like, myself, as Nina mentioned, I come from a background of permaculture, which is all about a deep understanding of complex systems, specifically natural systems, and creating long-lasting solutions that are rooted in an understanding of those systems. And so one thing permaculture has taught me is that you can't solve any challenge in a complex society, in a complex system, without really understanding that system. And so before we attempted any solution to this food desert concept in the neighborhood, we did a lot of talking, a lot of research. We got people in our community to fill out surveys. We just did like a lot of one-on-one discussions. We asked them, where do they get their food currently? How much do they spend on food? How many people are on food stamps? What kinds of food would they like to see? Do they need education on growing food or cooking food or nutrition? And after all of that data came together, only then, after the GrowHaus had been around for maybe 3 years or so, did we really come up with a model that we felt was going to last. And so that model looks like this. One of the things we do at the GrowHaus is we grow food commercially in a recirculating hydroponic and aquaponic system. And that's mostly leafy greens, lettuce and kale and cilantro, things like that. So we take a lot of that food, but then obviously you need more than that for a complete diet to make tasty meals. So then we go out of our way to connect with local farmers, bakers, ranchers, things like that, and either get food donated from them or purchase it in bulk so that we get it really cheaply. So that we're getting hundreds of pounds of apples every week and carrots and 50 loaves of bread donated from Blue Point Bakery. And we store all of that and then we sort it into these weekly food boxes that if you're familiar with a CSA, it's kind of like that model, but you just buy it on a week-by-week basis. And then we sort those boxes, and then folks in the Elyria-Swansea neighborhood get to purchase those boxes at cost, at what it took us to buy those ingredients, which, since we're getting them in bulk, a lot of them we're getting for free, is not much. So we're selling that food at cheaper than Walmart prices, but it's farmers market quality food. And then we're selling it at farmers market-ish prices to people around town who can afford that and who understand this model and want to support our mission. And so that keeps that program self-sustaining. So embodied in this model are kind of two of our core beliefs at the GrowHaus. One is that we don't believe in handouts because handouts are ultimately disempowering. There's certainly many people in our neighborhoods who can't even pay Walmart prices for food, and we're working with them to get them the food they need for free. But a lot of folks are hardworking, working class families. They don't want to get free food, even if they also don't want to have to drive 3 miles to Walmart. And so by asking people to pay, even if it's something really cheap, even if it's a nominal price, we believe that that's empowering to people, more empowering than just making them come and beg for it. And then the second thing is that we want our own model to be regenerative. We're a nonprofit, but we don't want to have to rely on grants and handouts ourselves in order to make this work. So that's why we're leveraging the power of the community at large and their purchasing power and their interest and support for this, which is great, and we're really lucky that there is so much interest and support to make this model work. So we've been doing this for about 6 or 8 months, and it's just been growing every month as the word gets out in the community, as more and more people outside the community find out about it. So at this point we're selling 50, 60 boxes per week, and we also have a pay what you can market, so kind of like Same Cafe, who some of you guys probably heard from earlier. They have a pay what you can restaurant, we have a pay what you can farm stand. So all these ingredients that are in these weekly food boxes, you can also just buy a la carte, one thing at a time, and pay whatever you can afford for those. Okay, and these are just some photos of us sorting out those food boxes, and this is that market that I was just talking about. this is some of our marketing material for the neighborhood, and then this is the marketing material for people outside the neighborhood. So we have two sizes of boxes. Our basic box is $20, which is enough for a family for a week of one or two. And then if you have a bigger family, this family box is $37.50. If any of you guys are interested in this program, it's mercadolago.com. And you can sign up for the boxes, pick them up to the GrowHaus every week, and all that. Okay, so now I'm going to totally shift gears, zoom way out, and talk about what does food security look like from a bioregional perspective. So the term bioregion means a region that's defined by the ecosystem, by natural characteristics rather than man-made lines, right? Like Colorado is a square state, it's very arbitrary, but our bioregion is not. Our bioregion has been shaped over thousands or even millions of years by natural forces. And so we sit here actually at the edge between two bioregions, right? Between the Rocky Mountains, which has within it many different kind of subregions of forests and valleys, and then the high plains, which extend from here pretty much all the way to somewhere in the middle of Kansas. And so what I'm mostly going to talk about is the high plains, since that's technically the one we're on right now. Some of you might live in the mountains, but I know I live on the high plains, and probably most of us in the Front Range do as well. So skipping ahead a little bit, one really important feature to understand about the high plains is that we're in what's called a rain shadow. So if you can picture this being the Pacific Ocean, and this being the Rocky Mountains, there's all this warm air evaporating off of the Pacific Ocean. The winds blow it into California. A lot of it drops as rain in the Central Valley or other places in California. And then the Rocky Mountains, as well as the Sierra Nevadas, make that warm air go high into the atmosphere where it gets cooled down. And then by the time it comes back down, all the moisture has left it. And so essentially we don't get the benefit of any of that warm, moist air coming off of the Pacific, which is why we're in what's generally called a semi-arid environment. So this is what the high plains looks like, or at least what it looked like, before we started messing with it a few hundred years ago. And there's obviously still large areas of it that look like this. So there's not a whole lot going on there for people. It's a lot of short grasses, buffalo grass. There's some cacti, yucca, things like that, rolling hills. But it didn't always look like that. And kind of coming from this permaculture perspective, one of the things I really strongly believe is that we don't have to be a negative influence on these ecosystems. We can co-create with them. And that's been done in the past before many, many times. And even here in the high plains, as you'll see, we've totally revamped our ecosystems at least twice. And so what essentially I'm going to be proposing is a third revamp. So this is actually kind of what our ecosystem used to look like maybe 20, 30,000 years ago. More like the Serengeti. There were more trees. It wasn't just plains. And there were all different kinds of animal species. There were all these... I don't know why it's doing this. You guys are getting a sneak preview of it. There are all these megafauna, all these massive creatures that were present in this continent, all up and down from South America to Canada, that pretty much all went extinct within 1,000 years of the first arrival of Native Americans here. We pretty much hunted them to extinction because they didn't recognize that we were a danger. They didn't grow up with us. So, as you can imagine, all these animals shaped that ecosystem in very specific ways, and when they all died, the ecosystem kind of had to find a new equilibrium. And this is what it looked like for another maybe 10,000 years. It was the Native Americans actually took down a lot of the trees, turned it from a savanna into a grassland to more easily manage their kind of keystone species, which was the bison. And this was really a bison-based economy here in the high plains for thousands and thousands of years. And so, the Native Americans were nomadic. In the winter, they were up in the mountains, and then in the summer, they came down here to do the big bison herding and killing. And then they would dry the bison, pound it, make it into this thing called pemmican mixed with choke cherries and other berries. And that would be like their kind of survival food for the next several months. And then this is the second big makeover. And this is the European makeover. Right? So this is what we've done over the last 100, 200 years. is, we're used to growing food with more water. We're used to European crops, crops from the Fertile Crescent like wheat. We've also adopted crops like corn. All of these things need a lot of water, which we don't really have here. So what do? We take it from somewhere else, specifically the other side of the Great Divide, where all that rain from the rain shadow does fall. So we're pumping it underground. We're also depleting the underground water in what's called the Ogallala Aquifer. So there are hundreds of thousands of acre feet of water in this massive aquifer that have been stored up over millions of years, and now we're pumping that dry. That's our kind of savings account of water, and that's dwindling rapidly, all in order to irrigate these things. And this is a map of the San Luis Valley, and each one of these little circles is about a mile across. So if you picture this whole area is larger than the square mileage of Boulder, and all being irrigated from something that would or should look like this, like desert, into these giant crops. And a lot of these crops are things that humans can't even eat. It's forage for cattle, which are raised in stockyards, as I'm sure you guys are all aware, and just becoming McDonald's hamburgers or something like that. So all this water is being pumped. The water's not being used very efficiently, and then it's going towards things that aren't healthy for us. So clearly, this isn't necessarily a sustainable or healthy way of providing our food. This is just a quick graph of the water that we use in the state of Colorado. So we think a lot about saving water, like in the shower, or not using the sprinkler on our lawns as much. But all of that, everything we use in cities, is this little slice right here. And this is how much water is used to grow those crops that you were just seeing. So that's the scale at which agriculture is impacting ecosystems. This is the reason why the Colorado River doesn't make it to the Gulf of California anymore, and it runs dry because we're using all that water for agriculture. And then another added side effect is that the way we grow in monoculture, I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this, right? We just grow massive fields of one thing, we till it all. And it erases that topsoil. There's nothing covering the soil, nothing holding the water in when it does fall, and so then it leads to things like that, right? Like the Dust Bowl. Our largest export in this country by tonnage is topsoil. It's not corn, it's not wheat. There's something like 10 tons of topsoil that wash into our oceans and rivers for every person in this country every year. And that topsoil, again, takes thousands of years to form. So when we talk about food security in the big picture, this is why I think it's important to understand these issues, right? Because it's one thing where we're still living in a society where where we still have topsoil in California, where we still have enough water to import food from California to at least feed the rich people, right? But that's not necessarily always going to be the case. And if we don't start thinking about these bigger issues in our climate, at some point, it's not just going to be folks in Elyria, Swansea that are struggling to feed themselves. So what might it look like if there's 3-4 million of us up and down the Front Range? How can we take all of these factors, what's already happening here in this bioregion, and start to really look at what will it take to nourish ourselves and for us all to thrive, rich people, working class people alike, using some different thinking about how we get our food. So I'm going to talk about several different permaculture strategies for food security. As you can imagine, I think that the limiting factor in this ecosystem more often than not is water. And so, I was just at a hike last weekend around Mount Sanitas, just a couple miles from here, and saw this, which is erosion from the recent flooding that happened here last fall. And this is how grasslands or other ecosystems turn into desert. Because what's happening is this is creating an arroyo. Now every time it rains, all the water is just rushing down here really quickly. It's not soaking into any of this surrounding grassland. It's starving it of all the water. And then meanwhile, this is rushing really, really quickly downstream because we don't have any impervious surfaces in our cities. It's creating flooding, as you guys probably know all too well. And so it's causing all kinds of problems and depriving our ecosystems of the water, which, water is life. There's no water in this ecosystem. If we're not making use of the little water that is here, then we really can't grow anything. So these are some techniques for changing that. Starting way high in the watershed, in the little creeks, where the erosion first might start. These are just things made out of rocks. This is called a Zuni bowl, named after the Zuni Indians who perfected this technique thousands of years ago, of taking that arroyo, that deep kind of mini canyon, and starting to reshape it so that as that water starts spilling down, it stays in this bowl and has a chance to slow down before it makes its way down the watershed. And this is another similar thing. This is called a check dam, and it's just rocks that are held together with wire, something called gabions. And so as the water is coming down the mountain here, it stays in this check dam and it spills over a little bit into the landscape and has a chance to sink in instead of just rushing away and taking topsoil with it. So once we do that, and this is that same technique but applied at a much, much smaller scale. This is just in my front yard, where instead of taking the water flowing from the roof and letting it go out to the street, we just have a sunken little garden bed and we're planting all kinds of strawberries and lettuce in there. So it's the same idea. It's thinking about where is your water coming from and keeping it as close to the source as possible for as long as possible, and making it take this circuitous winding path instead of channeling it in these vast flows to big water treatment plants or to big irrigation facilities, things like that. Okay, so that's water. Now let's talk about wind a little bit. So out on the high plains, we have all these big winds coming off the mountains. It's often much, much more windy, 15, 20 miles away from the mountains than it is right off the mountains, because the wind really starts gaining momentum. And once you get deep into the plains, that's where you start to get into the tornado country, right? So things we can do to change that on a large scale is we can create windbreaks. If you go to areas that have been farmed consecutively for many centuries, this is a common feature of the landscape. You'll see the farm plots broken up by these windbreaks so that as the wind is flying down the plains, it gets pushed up, like you can see in this graphic here, and doesn't do as much harm in blowing away soil like you saw in that earlier slide. And then these windbreaks can be multifunctional, right? So these windbreaks can have things in them that are adding nutrients back into the soil, helping create that topsoil, that have a lot of biomass that their leaves are shedding, and they're creating habitat for pollinators. Maybe the windbreaks themselves even are fruit trees and have edible things in them. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, you start to get into something called agroforestry, where instead of growing crops, these annual crops like corn and rice and wheat and soy over vast areas, you're growing a mix of annual crops and perennial crops. These are trees, and those are planted on the contours of the slope of the land. So just like you saw with those check dams and Zuni bowls, each one of these little rows is holding water as it flows down the landscape. So I bet any water that falls on this property, none of it's leaving, none of it's exiting and causing erosion farther downstream. Every drop of it is being used to grow these nut trees and fruit trees, to create fodder for these sheep that are grazing in between the rows of fruit and nut trees. So you're creating this entire forest ecosystem that is creating sustenance for you, building topsoil, and restoring the watershed. Another really key thing in this climate is animal-based systems. Why? Because if you look out at that grassland, not much of that is edible to us, right? Like of the biomass that is created in our ecosystem, and there's not a ton of it compared to like a tropical rainforest, but of this stuff that is growing, we can't eat almost any of it. Maybe a few choke cherries here, or wild grapes, but animals can. And they can store it for long periods of time. They can store that energy in their fat and in their meat. And so this was the only way that humans were able to subsist here before fossil fuels, before railways, before imports of food, was by storing that energy in the form of buffalo meat throughout the winter and then letting the Native Americans harvest it later. So it's not to say that you can't be a vegan or a vegetarian and live sustainably in Colorado, but it's probably going to be a whole lot harder. Because these guys, like alpacas, are a great example of an animal-based system that comes from a similar bioregion to ours in Peru, where they were domesticated in concert with a grain called quinoa. And the alpacas would graze these big fields of quinoa. That would be their forage. And then the quinoa seeds are able to pass right through their system and be deposited back on the land and be in this nutritious packet of fertilizer where they would grow back up into quinoa fields that then we would harvest and eat as a grain. So we would get the wool from the alpacas and sometimes the meat, and then we would get the quinoa grain as well. So thinking creatively about how we can take these grasslands and turn them into something useful for us using animals is another good strategy. I think we're probably all familiar with various concepts of season extension, right? And that can span the gamut from, this is something called row cover. So this is pretty much just a fancy cloth that you put over your plants. And even just a fancy cloth like that can help keep the frost out or keep the shade out when it's really, really hot. And so that can dramatically change your yields. This is the next level up. This is a little cold frame. This is what's often called a low tunnel. This is a high tunnel that you can walk inside. And then this is a more permanent greenhouse. So just depending on where you're at, how much space you have, how much money you have, how much time you have, any number of these solutions gets more and more sophisticated, but all of them in our really crazy climate can make a big difference, right? Because we live in a place where it's sunny all year round. We might get 50, 60-degree days in February, and then we'll get big snows like we have been in April or even May. So having something to kind of buffer those crazy swings is really, really important for kind of evening out our yields. And then this is the greenhouse kind of taken to a really large scale. This is another shot of the GrowHaus. And so once you're able to create that controlled environment in a large space and use really kind of more high-tech systems using no soil at all, but just water with fertilizer in it, whether that comes from somewhere off-site or it comes from fish or even worms in the case of vermiponics or aquaponics. You can start to recycle that water hundreds or thousands of times, and in a water-scarce state like ours, that's really important. So we're growing 10 times the amount of lettuce that you could grow in the same amount of soil using 10 times less water. So it's just orders of magnitude more food per water than you would get if this was just a field of lettuce. And then there's, of course, what kind of plants we're growing. And so a big part of this is shifting our own perspectives about what's important for food. We're still in the mindset, even folks who are really excited about local food and try and grow a lot of their own food or buy a lot of locally grown food, we're still in the mindset, and myself included, of buying things that really don't make sense to grow here, right? Like tomatoes. Tomatoes need a ton of water. They need a ton of fertilizer. Same thing with most of your leafy greens, lettuce, cabbage. Certainly corn is a super heavy feeder, and how much of our diet is made up of corn or corn-derived products. So how can we start to think about what is the food that wants to grow here? What is the food that makes sense to grow in this area with crazy late frosts and erratic rainfall? And how can we base our diet around that? And the truth is there's all kinds of really great kinds of food like that. We're just not used to them. And so we have to start growing them at a commercial scale, learning how to process them, learning how to make delicious recipes with them, and popularizing this idea of bioregionally appropriate agriculture. So I'm just going to breeze through some of these real quick, and I'm happy to give you resources on any of these afterwards. But there's a plant called Goomy that adds nitrogen to the soil, so it helps all the other plants around it. It's very drought tolerant, and it has these really tart, nutritious berries. So we could be using that instead of, say, cranberries. Prickly pear is a cactus that we see all over the place, right? And this is like a really important food in the cuisine of many Native Americans from here all the way down to central Mexico. The pads are really tasty and nutritious. The fruit tastes kind of like strawberries once you boil it down. Sunchoke was a staple food of many Native Americans in this area. It's really abundant. You can make all kinds of things out of it. And it's actually been proven to reduce symptoms of diabetes. So when you're talking about communities that have been impacted by this really, agribusiness commercial food for years and the obesity rates are sky high, this could be a solution for that. Quinoa, I already talked about. It's an arid adapted grain, high in protein. Sorrel is a really kind of tart, leafy green that's a perennial. It comes back really early in the season, so my sorrel's coming back in my garden right now. I didn't have to do anything this year, but now I can make salads from it. Currant, which some folks might be familiar with, grows all up and down the foothills, just a few miles from here. There's many different kinds of currant. They can grow in the shade and the sun. They're really drought tolerant. They're really tasty. Nanking Cherry is, as the name implies, from arid China. It's related to the cherries we're used to, but it's a little bit shorter, and it's much, much, much hardier to drought and cold. And I think that's it in terms of all the different species and techniques. So hopefully that wasn't like way too much information for you guys. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments or anything like that.
Awesome, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
There is an organization, I can't remember, I think it's Wildlands Restoration?
Yes.
Or something like that?
Uh-huh.
Do they do any work with soil erosion way up
Yes.
north with their volunteers?
They do, yeah. It's called Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, I believe.
Yeah.
And yeah, they do great work along very similar lines as I was talking about. They've been working a lot in the areas impacted by the recent burns, helping stabilize that soil and take out dead trees that are causing more of a hazard than a help to the ecosystem, things like that. So they're a great organization to get involved with. Yeah.
Is there some kind of law against water catching around these states? I thought that I had heard.
Yes, there is. We have these really kind of old, outdated, not very functional water laws in this state. You're not allowed to store water in a cistern. However, none of the things that I was describing fall under that law. So you're allowed to redirect water into the soil however, wherever you want it. All of that is totally legal. And in fact, you can store hundreds, thousands of times more water in the soil than you ever could in any size cistern. So a cistern would be great if it were legal for things like taking a shower with your rainwater or things like that, indoor use. But again, as you saw from that slide, there's much more water we use to grow our food than we use for ourselves. Yeah.
Between the hydroponic crops and the inland crops, like I understand that the hydroponics save a lot of water, but also I think like in land, the soil needs the water and needs crops to dump the road. Like I don't know, it's a real solution, the hydroponic, or it's just like a temporal solution, like just for regions that there are many desert there. So okay, we plant in like hydroponic, but not in the forest. Like no,
Right.
it's not a.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a great point. And it's a complicated issue, so I don't know if there's any simple answer to it. But I agree that in areas that have the capacity for people to get all of the food they need without damaging the ecosystem directly from the ecosystem, we should try to be doing that first. Because that's generally the techniques that are going to last much longer. That even hydroponics, it uses way less water, sure, but look at all the plastic it uses. Look at if you're not doing it really, really smart, it can often use a ton of fossil fuels to heat the greenhouse. So there's a lot of challenges with a hydroponic and aquaponic system that I see them really as kind of interim solutions for the next couple generations. That might sound like a long time, but again, we're trying to think about permanent culture here, permanent agriculture. So I agree that we should ultimately be trying to get our food from the land, but in the meantime, while we have all these people and we're used to eating lettuce and all of those things, those are a great way to go. Yeah.
Most of the farmland around here has been so abused by conventional agriculture that you really can't grow much of anything in its current state. What are some of your strategies to reverse that? And have you heard of the Savory Institute? Are you
Yes.
aware of some of the work they're doing?
Yeah, and I was actually going to mention rotational grazing in this talk. I just kind of didn't have time to fit it in because it's such a big concept in and of itself. But yeah, I actually just saw Alan Savory speak at a conference a couple weeks ago. And yeah, I think that's a really great point that before we can grow our food bioregionally, we have to heal a lot of this land that has been so abused. Unfortunately, a lot of the techniques that permaculture has to offer in terms of reshaping the land with these kind of swales on contour with the hill to soak that water in, to break up the land, because often what's happened is it creates this hard crust that all the water will just flow off of, so we have to break that crust. Certain crops that can penetrate through that and start to break up the soil. So just depending on the site and the location and things like that, there are definite techniques for healing it. But you're right, all of that industrial agriculture has set us back in some ways more than it's brought us forward. So it's going to take a lot of work to clean up those messes as well as just kind of provide the food itself. Yeah.
Taking it back to the food justice aspect.
Yeah.
Although thank you for speaking so comprehensively and briefly about the production aspect, because that's something that I think we have to think about in order to do anything in the justice aspect in a long-term situation. But I digress. In Elyria Swansea, how have you seen the reaction from the community to the types of food that you provide? It's a major shift from what people are used to, and there's a huge education piece there and a huge culture piece there.
Yep.
What's your experience?
Sure. No, that's a great question. Well, we meet people where they're at. We start with what they want. And so it's not like we're going to be serving Nanking cherries and Sunchokes in our food boxes to people in the neighborhood, right? Unless they're asking for it, which they might at some point. But first, all of those surveys we did at the beginning was to help us figure out, like, what are the 10 or 12 ingredients you eat now? And how can we source those as locally as possible, as sustainably as possible? But you'll see in the food boxes that go out to neighbors, there's avocados in there. There's limes and lemons and things that definitely won't grow here ever. But we want to make sure that they're getting that food in a healthy way that they're used to first. And then, as we're starting to teach a lot of people in the neighborhood more and more about growing their own food, about permaculture, and now of their own interest, they're asking us, well, what about this plant? What about that plant? And so we're kind of just guiding them along at whatever pace they're interested in. But I think that's a really important point, is especially when you're talking about social justice issues, you want to meet people where you're at and not shove these crazy ideas down people's throats. Yeah.
I had a question about how you were talking about soilless systems and how you just have water that has been fertilized.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, how does that work without aggravating the problem of dead zones downstream? Like if you add lots of nitrogen and phosphorus to water, the official term is escaping me right now.
Eutrophication?
Yes, eutrophication downstream. How do you prevent that when you're adding fertilizer directly to the water?
Sure, yeah. So in an aquaponic system, you pretty much, there is no downstream. It's almost a completely self-contained space. The water doesn't really leave unless you have like a real disaster and you have to flush it out. In a hydroponic system, which is somewhat less of a closed loop permaculture system, you do have to flush it every once in a while because otherwise the salts would build up. And so at the GrowHaus, which is the example I'm most familiar with, we're actually going to be designing a constructed wetland in this space that we're flushing those liquids and designing it to absorb as much of those nutrients and salts as possible and turn them into even more useful products, like willow trees that then we can cut and create baskets out of, or things that we can burn in a super efficient rocket mass heater, things like that. So that's a really important thing to be considering, though, those kind of long-term effects. Yeah?
Is there anyone in this bioregion or a similar environment doing test plots in broad scale?
Not that I know of. I mean, I think it's definitely something that we're on the verge of there being enough interest and expertise in this bioregion for. There's certainly folks doing kind of similar things down in New Mexico, a lot in the Great Plains, kind of more the Midwest area. That shot I showed of overhead, that's a place in Minnesota. So it's on its way here, but it's not quite there yet. I think we're still a few years out. Basically, the permaculture community. So different people who own land and are interested in permaculture are starting to experiment with that on their land. I will say, actually, in Paonia, in that kind of area in the North Fork Valley, there are several folks who are starting to kind of push that edge of looking at those crops and which ones are doing well and which ones aren't. And that's something I'm personally always on the lookout for, opportunities to test out in a broad scale way.
Is there any kind of legislation, or is it even being talked about, like mandating crop rotation, or is there any kind of incentive outside of, obviously it's the best thing and will eventually lead to more production, but is there anything on a government level that is at least in the works on trying to deal with this problem?
Kind of, not exactly, or certainly not at the scale that is necessary. I mean, any kind of legislation that would affect things on at least the national scale would be in our Farm Bill, which is renegotiated every 5 years. Our most recent Farm Bill just passed after a very, very tense series of negotiations and more lobbying on behalf of the sustainable food movement than there ever has been. And yet, despite all that lobbying, all the changes in that Farm Bill are minuscule. It's like now we have $5 million of funding instead of $2 million, so that's great. But in the face of it's an almost $1 trillion bill. So just the scale of big agriculture and their kind of influence and power at this point is still just dwarfing any of the kind of positive ideas that we're trying to introduce into the system. But I mean, ultimately, I think it needs to get to that level. We need to start affecting policy at that level in order to be able to make these changes.
There's nothing on the local level in Colorado?
There are efforts on a smaller scale. I mean, certainly, at the municipal scale, like I'm on the Sustainable Food Policy Council for Denver along with Dana, who just spoke earlier. But there's only so much you can influence at the city level. And then I'm not as familiar with what's happening in between in terms of like the State Department of Agriculture and things like that, but from what I understand, from what I've seen, it's still very much mostly focused on kind of industrial agriculture.
So we have time for about 2 more questions before we wrap up. And if we can just pick those, and I'm sure, Adam, you're totally available for any afterwards. And
you bet.
So
Cool.
seek him out.
All right, Beth, how are you in the front? And then, you can go left.
Okay. Along the lines of what she was talking about, I know that Boulder County has been growing GMO crops on Boulder County land. And one of the arguments was conventional farmers say it's too expensive, I don't know how to do that stuff, it would take me so long to convert, blah, blah, blah. Is there any effort in the permaculture or sustainable community to help conventional farmers kind of stop that stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, that farm I showed that was in Minnesota, that's run by a guy named Mark Shepard. And he's like right in the heart of that. I mean, you couldn't quite see it from the photos, but his property is a couple dozen acres, and it's surrounded by thousands of acres of industrial GMO corn and alfalfa and things like that. And he is really proactive about reaching out to that community and, again, meeting them where they're at, getting them to start with something simple and small and basic, and not trying to get them to totally change what they're doing, because that just puts people on edge.
Yeah.
And so, I'm certainly not that person. I don't know much about industrial agriculture, other than the bad things about it. But I think we need more people like that in Colorado. I think our divide between urban and rural, like between us all here and most of the folks that are growing all that food out in the plains, is just so vast, and we need more people to be kind of bridging those gaps. And I'm sure there are great people doing that out there, but I'm not in as much connection with them. All right, last question.
Anyone else?
Well, I just wanted to say the Boulder County today had a workshop all day long on is organic agriculture.
Oh, cool.
An option for you. Right. So they are making an effort to bridge that transition and have the Colorado Department of Agriculture and the USDA in to talk about the details of making that transition. So Boulder County's kind of on the front of trying to help with that, but not to the level of permaculture.
What's your answer to people who say that permaculture isn't an appropriate method for feeding lots of people? It can't produce enough.
I think, well, there's a lot of different ways to approach it. I mean, I think in some ways we have to acknowledge that, like, our population here is above the carrying capacity of this ecosystem. Like, we probably won't be able to support 4 million people indefinitely in any shape or form. So there's that to consider. There's also, I think, certainly if the kind of ratios of farmers to non-farmers stays the way it is, I also think that argument is true. Because permaculture is a much more labor-intensive way of growing food than this kind of industrial model, which is like 1 person per 1,000 acres. I think implicit in a lot of these ideas in saying we should be growing our food this way means a lot more of us need to be growing food and need to be actively involved in that at small or large scales. And then the third thing I would say is permaculture advocates for diversity, which includes a diversity of growing options, which includes growing options that I wasn't even talking about that might be more conventional. So it's not like this is the only way we need to be growing our food. I think if I was to say that, we'd be falling into the same trap that got us into this problem in the first place. So permaculture is one solution among many, many solutions. It's appropriate for certain contexts. It's not appropriate for others. But I think it's certainly appropriate for many more situations than it's being used in at this point. All right, well, I'm happy to answer any other questions you guys have afterwards. I can just kind of hang out back there. Thank you all for listening, for your great questions.